EWBC, this is our 5th anniversary, and thank you for coming. It's amazing to see so many people here from so many countries. What was the official number this year?
Total number of countries was 40.
40 countries.
40 different countries.
Before we get started with our stuff, I'd like to invite up to the stage somebody to talk about Turkish wine that we're going to be enjoying this week. Mr. Ali Bashman from the Wine Producers Association of Turkey. Please welcome him to the stage.
Dear guests, welcome to the EWBC 2012 conference in Izmir. It is a great pleasure for us to host you in Izmir for this very special conference. 2012 became a conference and congress year for Turkish wines to host two major events. 35th Organisation International de la Vigne et du Vin Congrès in June and 5th EWBC conference the same year in the same city these days. We believe EWBC is a unique congress which brings the opinion leaders of the community together and let them create networks on the basis of friendship, common sense, and search for information. Wine also, it has a beginning. This year, EWBC is being held in geography that is probably the beginning of the story. We hope that there will be discussion about this subject in search for the truth. As Wine of Turkey, we believe the Grand Terroir, which covers many countries and culture, can best tell the story of the beginning and EWBC them source. Turkish wine will spoken not only with the history, but also with more than 800 indigenous grape varieties, Anatolian cuisine, tourism, and with the current quality level of its wine. Only in the last 2 years, the number of medal that Turkish wine received are above 500. And in 2012, the average medals rate of Wine of Turkey was among IWC, Decanter, and IWSC was 78%. After starting our generic effort in 2008, Turkish wines gained a geometric increase in its publicity in abroad. This year, Turkish wines stayed to take its place in Eastmade section of prestigious wine store chain in UK, in Australia, in Germany. We believe not only generic approach of the market, but also collaborative approach starting with all neighbor countries from Aegean Sea to Caucasus, from Black Sea to Mediterranean. We believe also we shall contribute to each other to serve the world better wines with better values. This conference can start this collaboration. This conference can open the doors of the mind of the people, showing to them wine gets the culture together, people together, and it's not just an alcohol. Let's look at all these countries in the Grand Terroir testing, different countries from the land of the oldest civilization in this world. Turkey, unlike other countries, needs to widen the wine culture within the country. EWBC can be an important asset to get the attention of the government and media within Turkey to realize the fact the wine culture belongs to this land we are living in and actually spread all the word from the heart of the Grand Terroir. Turkey is in accession negotiation with European Union, and Izmir city is a candidate for Expo 2020. This factor naturally make all EWBC participants cultural ambassador of Turkey all over of the world. With the opportunity, we would like to thank the Culture and Tourism Ministry for their support for this conference, and Welcome to all this geography in wine culture, but also representing the newest quality winemaking country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tanner, would you like to come up? Tanner here's from Wines of Turkey and has helped make this happen, and he wants to say a little bit about coming here.
Hi everyone, welcome to EWBC in Izmir in Turkey. This has been a dream since 2010, and when Gabriela approached me about Turkey, Turkish wine, and any kind of support from that they can get in one of their conferences, such as after party sponsorship or something like that, I said, why don't we host the conference? And she said, are you serious? I said, why not? So this, actually, to tell the truth, I wasn't sure of myself. It was a little gambling. But after we got the support of Culture and Tourism Ministry, it became a reality. So I won't take your time too much. Here, I would like to thank you, Verizon, for their excited approach to Turkey from the day one. And Culture and Tourism Ministry for making this possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't, this would stay as a dream. And Arkas, as a leading company in Izmir, they supported us a lot. And Izmir Chamber of Commerce. And to all wineries, not only from Turkey, but from all our neighborhood countries, that they will be here as part of Grand Terroir. And finally, and most importantly, I would like to thank you for coming to Turkey, despite Sandy, despite the conflict in Syria, elections, strikes all over Europe. This shows how much you love wine and how much you want to discover the roots. Thank you.
The Born Digital Awards, you'll see, is mentioned as a sponsor of the event. Obviously, this is something that actually came out of the EWBC, which was about how can we reward people who come to these events, who hear all these stories, who meet all these producers, how can we reward them and show the stuff that they've produced. And we created the Born Digital Awards 3 years ago out of the EWBC and the conversations we'd had over the years with you guys. It took a long time to distill it into a concept. We're still working on the launch of the next year's. We'll make announcements about that separately. But what's really important is that, first of all, we got some winners here. So we got Jim Budd for his excellent Panchogate coverage. Who, we've also got Ryan O'Connell here somewhere for his fantastic work, showcasing what a winery can do when they build up their profile online. I think Louise Huren here as well, who...
oh, there she is.
There you are. Communications.
Proud.
And I think, I can't remember the number, but a very interesting number of EWBC participants made it into the shortlists. We don't give you preferential treatment, but I think there's a connection between the people who write the kind of stuff, also the people who know about it and obviously submit. And we want you to spread the word and have the submissions as broad as possible, but we already went up 50% this year, and we hope we will see that grow again. Oh yes, and we obviously got our judges who came out of this. We've got Ellen, I think Christian here, documentally, was a judge on the photography and stuff as well. So thank you all very much to the judges. So the important thing is, please, you're here at the EWBC, you are all content creators. The information, the tag for this year is Be the Source. Here in Turkey, and with a lot of the wines you're seeing, if you write an article about it, you are going to be the source of that wine, that winery, that winemaker that you have interviewed, because the chances are they have not been covered in an English or French or German speaking language, anything other than Turkish before. You will be the source of that. That's a great potential for being useful content that will be shared. That's exactly the kind of content the Born Digital Wine Awards wants. It's exactly the kind of stuff that EWBC wants, and I'm sure Wines of Turkey and our sponsors will be quite keen on it too. So if you do, please distill your experiences here into blog posts and longer form content. That is the content that has lasting power. It will continue. tweets and Facebook updates, as exciting as they are at the time, do not have that lasting power. They are not sources of information. So we really hope that you'll create great content out of the EWBC and submit it to the Born Digital.
When we started the EWBC back in 2008, we didn't know what it was going to become. We were a collective of wine drinkers who got together in Rioja. We all shared the same passion for this liquid that we found in our glasses. Many of us had never heard of SEO. Facebook was new. Twitter, most people thought was a passing fad. And we were getting together in Rioja just to get to know each other. Maybe figure something out. We didn't know what. And we knew what we were doing was possibly important, but we weren't sure why at the time. I know that some of us at the time thought it might be the next big step in wine journalism, this blogging, but that we might become the next new gatekeepers. But I don't think we really believed it. When you look around at what's happening in communications today, or 5 years later, we're sitting here in Izmir embarking on 3 days of discussion and discovery. You, the audience, you're as diverse as the grapes from the wines that we drink. Some of us are the new tastemakers. Many of you are in the business, starting to look at the communications happening online and wondering what to make of it. And yet some of you are just here because you love this beverage we call wine. And then there's the most important people, the winemakers, who have the stories to share and, most importantly, are going to help us quench our thirst. Turning to our theme this year, I have an admission. When I look back at the EWBC, I don't see wine. Yes, we love wine, and as a collective group, it's what brings us together. But it's not the source of why we are here today. Back in 2007, we'd begun to realize that the real power of the internet was not the content it presented, it was the connectivity it facilitated. For the first time, you could create communities that crossed borders, that ignored passports, that united people around common themes. And when I think really hard about it, I realize that the source of the EWBC is community. It's this community that brings us together and makes us stronger. It's a community that brings us back each year. And just because someone from within our community rises in the world of wine as an opinion leader doesn't necessarily make our community stronger or weaker unless that recognition helps the community as a whole. It is that collective range of interests and knowledge that we share that creates something truly powerful. It's the layers of knowledge we create as a group that makes us strong. I honestly worry a little bit today we've lost our way. The conversation oftentimes falls back to what is the ROI on one person's voice or another's, rather than what we should all be focusing on, the ROI of the community. We're all experts in something. Some of you are MWs, experts about wine, bearers of all things vinous. Some of us are the web geeks who know about the tools and how best to utilize them. And some of you, understand how to turn grapes into wine and quench our thirst, as I said. And finally, we have the people selling the wine to the customers, and those customers are asking more and more questions each day. But it's this collective that matters, this diversity of knowledge and strengths, even weaknesses that help make our community stronger. We're a global web of wine communications. A lot of people ask me every day, do blogs have influence? And what I think they mean to be, or what they're really asking, is which blogs are influential? The answer, in my opinion, is that blogs in the aggregate are hugely influential. One blog, no matter how big it is not strong without a web of others to share in spreading the message. It's a World Wide Web, not the World Wide Website. As you go and spend the next few days wandering around, listening to stories, tasting wines, we encourage you, please share these stories, share your experiences, suck up all that knowledge, every turn and from everyone you speak to. Remember, we're not here just for the wine. We're here for the community. And as they say, a community is only as strong as its weakest link. Each one of you has something to share, a perspective that I can learn from. Each year, someone I didn't know, in fact, this happens every year and I absolutely love it. People come up to me that I've never met before and share things that I've never thought of before. And I walk away inspired by people I'd never known before. And every year, those people come back and those relationships continue. I want to leave you with one last thought, something personal that happened to me that I think kind of illustrates all this. If you don't know, 7 years ago or so, we moved to Spain, me and my wife, and I was walking from vineyard to vineyard trying to find a job. And I went to one vineyard, and you'd all probably know the name, bigger, well-known winery. And I asked for a visit. They They invited me in. They were somewhat nice, but nobody really treated me very friendly, and nobody was very cordial, and it got pretty much the cold shoulder. So you fast forward about 2-3 years, I'm speaking at a large conference, and the winemaker comes up to me and he says, Ryan, I love Catavino. It's great. You have to come to our winery sometime. And I say, but I've been to your winery. And he said, well, what did you think of it? I said, I didn't like it. Nobody smiled, nobody said hello, nobody welcomed me in. And he looked at me and he said, but I didn't know who you were. We have over 270 people here, 280 people here today. I encourage you to go out, shake some hands with people you don't know. You don't know who's sitting next to you right now and who that person might be tomorrow. We have a very diverse community here of people from all over the world. Turkey, it's a country of food, wine, and a culture that's truly amazing we've fallen in love with, and we are absolutely humbled to have you here to share that experience with us. So thank you for coming, and we're going to get moving on. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite our keynote speakers up to the stage. If you'd like to come up, Christian, Randall, and Andrew.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Burada olmak çok güzel. Thanks to Ume for helping me with the Turkish. In other words, in English words, it's very good to be here. Now, I'm going to begin by talking about sources in general and what source might mean to those of us who are reporting from the multiple front lines of the wine world. Then I'll get on to a few practical matters concerning those of us who write about wine, which I guess is most of us. And then I'll be quiet. Okay, the first 6 slides, I don't have tons of slides, as you'll quickly discover. I'm not enormously good at this sort of stuff, but I do have a few slides. The first 6 slides are going to show a source near where I live in eastern Languedoc, near a remote and secluded village called Saint-Jean-de-Bouège, which, by the way, is a very secret and intriguing part of that wonderful growing zone called Terrasse du Larzac. Now, source, of course, means spring in French, and this is a spring. It's very beautiful, very pure, and very quiet. Just water coming out of the ground. But it's hard not to feel a sense of awe when you're there. And since we're right at the beginning of this conference, it seemed to me that this was as good a moment as any to talk about passion and inspiration, because that, after all, is the source. That's the beginning of everything. That's why most of you have chosen to do what you're doing and have made the effort to come here. It's what's going to sustain you for however long you choose to do this, maybe for a lifetime. Now, 2 things matter about springs. The first is that they shouldn't dry up, and the second is that they should remain unpolluted. You don't want to run out of passion and inspiration, in other words, nor do you want that passion and inspiration to turn into cynicism or to lose its nourishment. The best way, I think, to avoid both hazards is to keep faith with the moment or moments of inspiration which brought you to wine in the first place. Now, I don't know what those are, only you do. Springs tend to come into being in quiet and secret places, but that freshness and that innocence lurks somewhere behind most of the best writing about wine. Indeed, it underlies most of the best communication in general. We see things most clearly from those who can contrive to suggest as if they're seeing them for the first time. Now, I know from experience that this vision will be constantly assaulted by the mundane and the familiar, by the endless repetition of the basics, and by the tedium of trying to make a living. But it's your job to safeguard and nourish the source, since in the long run it's what's going to safeguard and nourish you and your work. By the way, if you want to see these ideas developed in a slightly more philosophical way, have a look at an entry on my website called Wine and Astonishment. There's a link on the home page to that. Here's another source. This photograph shows Gustave Doré's first illustration for Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This crazy old tramp stomps into a village where a wedding is going on and insists on telling his ghastly tale to anyone who's prepared to listen. The story changes the life of the one wedding guest who stops to hear it. That's that guy looking kind of alarmed at the bottom. And then some hours later, the mariner staggers off again, condemned to retell and retell the story endlessly in order to mitigate the agony it causes him. Now, we bloggers aren't wedding guests hurrying away. We're eager listeners, or we should be. Every journalist and every blogger dreams of being collared by the ancient mariner. We're all looking for ghastly tales. A ghastly tale is a great story. Well, sadly, it's rare to meet winemakers prepared to confess that they've shot an albatross with a crossbow and survived a week on a ship of dead men, playing dice with a ghastly woman called Life in Death, and floating through a slimy sea quivering with water snakes. But never mind. The trick is to listen to everyone you meet as if he or she is the ancient mariner. There are stories hidden everywhere. All of your interlocutors, even the smoothest corporate men in suits, even the men from Champagne, are secretly wearing the tattered rags of experience. Wine explodes with stories because it's got so many creators and advocates, because every season is a new narrative, because every planted vineyard has a story to tell, and because every wine is a creation. So struggle to find that narrative frame. Learn to thread facts together so that they form a narrative necklace. If there's one thing that human beings are even thirstier for than for wine, it's for narrative. Stories are how we make sense of the senselessness in which we find ourselves. And by telling them, we keep madness and chaos at bay, as the ancient mariner did, or at least we try. Now, this is the third image that came to mind when I thought about source. But before I explain why it's important, let me just confess, first of all, why I shouldn't really be here. I never particularly wanted to be a blogger. I'm an old pen and paper man, really. As far as technology is concerned, and I hardly dare say this in front of Ryan and Christian, I'm a chronic late adopter who still has a pay-as-you-go mobile, who's always leaving chargers and adapters behind, who doesn't know one end of an iPad from the other, and whose biggest dread is having to acquire a new desktop because it would mean moving away from the familiar safety of Windows XP. And I'm not even a good journalist in that I don't ask very clever questions, I can't take shorthand, I write slowly with catastrophically bad handwriting, and I then struggle to read my own notes afterwards. I take a lot of time to write copy, which journalists aren't meant to, and then I fiddle about with it endlessly afterwards. I should also own up to being a second-rate wine geek. I love wine, both as substance and subject, but I'm not obsessed with it, and I crave time off from it, which is something that I never quite seem to get enough of. Anyway, if I am here, it's because I've learned how to make sauces. The meat, in other words, is not the whole story. The fish is not the whole story. It's important that there should be meat and fish. You have to deliver information, find and check facts, take positions, make sure that your tasting notes describe wines effectively, make sure that your scores are universally calibrated and coherent. You have to dig and delve. Opinion on its own is just the wind in the trees, not the entire landscape. And the retelling of a well-told story is only justified if you can add something to it, if you can move it on. All of that's true. Yet many of those writing about wine, I think, fret too much about being wine experts, about coming home to their readers with lumps of meat and fish, and not enough, perhaps, about being good communicators, learning, in other words, how to compose the sauces which make eating the meat and the fish such a pleasure. Let me put it another way. Blogging, like all communication, is a performance. Of course, you have to learn your lines and get your story straight, but what will make you a great blogger or a communicator is how well you perform with that material. That is actually the bigger challenge. Now, as I said a little earlier, one of the great pleasures of the wine world is that stories are everywhere. The wine world's a wonderfully plural and democratic place. There's no given hierarchy of stories, no thundering political herd which reporters are obligatorily obliged to follow. If you want to write about German Riesling or Chilean Pinot Noir when everybody else is writing about the Bordeaux Primeur, you'll have potential readers. And to turn those potential readers into enthusiastic readers or permanent followers of your work, you need to write about German Riesling and Chilean Pinot in a way that no one's ever done before. That sounds daunting, but it isn't, for the simple reason that no one has actually ever been you before. No one sees the world as you do. No one tastes as you do. The act of writing a single sentence involves thousands of choices, and those choices extend way beyond the grammar you use and the words you choose to the way you think about the subject. Your Chile is not my Chile. Your Riesling is not my Riesling. The challenge is to give your Chile and your Riesling maximum force of articulation. What you write about is not what matters most. It's the way you write about it which matters. So those are the three things I wanted to say about source in general. Number one, respect, guard, and nourish the place your inspiration comes from. Number two, turn all of your material into some sort of a story and look for the ancient mariner in those you meet. And number three, remember that protein alone doesn't make a great meal, or a great article, or a blog entry. It's the source which seduces. What I'll now do is try and address wine communication in a slightly more practical way. And if I refer to myself as I do so, it's not because I think I'm any more significant than any of you, but simply because that's the example I'm most familiar with. The fact that this conference exists is proof that the old wine writing world has disappeared. The creature, which we used to call a wine writer, has died. The wine writer is dead. By which I mean the comfortable old existence of press trips and press tastings and affable print articles in which you nuance your enthusiasms, plus the occasional sponsored ramble between hardcovers, is gone forever. I still write print articles, but they represent under 40% of my income, and the percentage falls further every year. It's also the least remunerative of all the many unremunerative things I do. I guess communicator is probably the word which best summarizes all the different things which most of us have to do to string a living together. Lecturing, consultancy if you can get it, wine tour guiding, wine judging, blogging, whatever comes along. I used to do a lot of radio work, and I loved that as much as writing. I've also written about other subjects, sometimes out of necessity, as well as wine, including whiskey and beer, tea, food, travel, and perfume. Now, some of you may be wondering how you can frame a career in this area. There is, I hardly need tell you, a huge amount of writing about wine, almost all of it nowadays unremunerated. Indeed, some of the best of it is unremunerated. There are no more livings to be made exclusively in that way. The wine world probably doesn't need more writers, except in two areas, which I'll come back to at the end. The wine world, though, will always need multitasking communicators, since the complications of wine can only be dissipated by interpretation, elucidation, evangelism, enthusiasm. This, in fact, is a great opportunity, since it means you can create your own job in your own way. If you want to be a great tennis player, there's only one option, which is to play tennis better than everybody else and to prove it by beating them. No two wine communicators, by contrast, ever have, in my experience, quite the same portfolio of activities. Everyone threads their patchwork into a slightly different quilt from everybody else. Everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. You can be, and indeed must be, your own sort of wine communicator. But it's important to realize that unless you're exceptionally lucky, it won't just involve writing, either in print or the electronic media. Let's go back to source. In practical terms, what sort of a source might you hope to become? And in particular, can anyone hope to be a generalist anymore in a wine world which, like the universe, is expanding rapidly in every direction? I think it is still possible to be a generalist. Indeed, everybody taking the MW exams, as I know some of you have done and will do, needs to become an accomplished generalist in very short order. If you decide to be a generalist, though, you'll be maximizing the number of potential competitors in your working life. And if I was beginning my career again, I don't think I'd assume that being a generalist was the default option or even the most enticing option. Everything depends, of course, on your economic circumstances and possibilities, but one colossal change since I quit my day job back in 1988 is that the internet means that you can be a source from anywhere, and a source with instant global reach too. It's never been easier, in other words, to implant or embed yourself in the wine world and to observe it at first hand. And as a wine communicator, that will give you insights which you'll never acquire on a press trip. Every language group, sooner or later, will need wine communicators to work in that language to deliver insights and information. And the English-speaking world already really needs English language sources embedded in every major wine region. And in due course, perhaps every major wine region will need a Chinese language source and maybe a Spanish language source too. So you might choose to appoint yourself to one of those vacancies. There is a sense, I think, in which all communicators increasingly work for a single employer, the internet. Of course, it's not an employer in the conventional sense, in that we still need to find our own income streams and package and sell our own products, but the internet provides direct and potentially equal access to those who are looking for communicative help and entertainment. None of us, in theory at least, needs the old gatekeepers anymore, the newspapers, the magazines, the publishing houses. Indeed, those who can most successfully generate income for themselves without recourse to the old gatekeepers will be creating the most durable and profitable model for wine writing in future. If you're making wine, you must have importers and distributors to take that heavy physical product to market. We're much more fortunate than that. We can clatter out a few words on the keyboard, print and revise them, and before the sun has recrossed the sky, they can be pleasing the end consumer in Singapore or Latvia. The key, though, is to plan the income-raising component of your communicative activity from the outset. If not, everything you do will be entropy, and the source will eventually run dry. Now, I'm about to be quiet, but let me just mention those two sorts of wine writing for which I feel there are urgent vacancies. The first is humorous or witty or caustic writing about wine, and the second would be wine writing powered by a kind of gonzo irreverence. Now, I'm not much good at either of those, but when you consider that 95% of wine drinkers take it for granted that wine is in some sense inseparable from hilarity, I suspect that almost all of us take it a bit too seriously, a bit too earnestly, a bit too reverently, and I'd certainly include myself in that. Almost every blogger, of course, is his or her own boss, so let rip. There's a future in levity, and I hope we're about to have a hilarious conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It was very good. Moving right on, I'd like to welcome up Randall Grahm to the stage to talk about his version of Source.
It's a real pleasure to be here in the presence of one of my real heroes. Andrew's comments were very soulful and thoughtful, as always. I had the distinct pleasure of speaking to a group of wine bloggers in Portland, Oregon, maybe some of you were there, in which I reflected somewhat pensively on the state of the wine business in the US, mostly lamenting a certain palpable loss of innocence and idealism. The gist of my remarks was that the recent great success of the wine business has at the same time sowed the seeds of its spiritual demise. Partially, it has been a function of people entering the business with more strictly business motives. Every single orthodontist, plastic surgeon, former athlete, television star, musician, or reasonably successful plumber with some disposable income has simultaneously decided that the wine business is the most appropriate vehicle for the expression of their artistic side. Whatever the reason for this phenomenon, we are now observing some of the well-known dynamics of an extremely overcrowded ecosystem. This does not bring out the most meritorious behavior in individuals, whether in rats, cellar rats, or winery owners. Because of the tremendous level of competition, you can see a sort of tragic level of self-consciousness on every level. One begins to consider the economic consequences of every winemaking decision that one makes. Do you dare produce an elegant wine that speaks in a quiet voice? How will it be heard over the deafening din of the agora? If you are a winery owner blessed with significant means, you are sorely tempted to hire the best consultants that money can buy, ones who have the capability to reverse engineer the Robert Parker Wine Spectator palate and instruct you on how you might make a wine guaranteed to get a high score rating. Not express individuality, mind you, but rather land squarely in the stylistic range of what passes among some tastemakers, at least as quality. It's not surprising that some successful winemakers, at least in the New World, are experiencing something like a sense of malaise. They're bored and perhaps even vaguely ashamed of the decadent state of affairs. Or perhaps they're not. The mere public mention of the word malaise, by the way, in a speech some 30-odd years ago, led to the undoing of the hapless American president, Jimmy Carter. It's good for all of you to understand that there's a ubiquitous American allergy, nowhere better expressed than in the American wine business, to acknowledging that all might not be exquisite sweetness and light within our perfect world. This neurosis carries through to our wine criticism, and our most influential critics seem to embrace wines that have no dark side at all and cast not a shadow. Not a sustainable proposition which we ignore at our own peril. I don't wish to speak entirely of the gloom and doom scenario that besets the New World, but before I dare to imagine with you an alternate reality for the improved trajectory of New World wines, allow me to express a sincere moment of heartfelt longing from the far side of the existential abyss. That gap that separates what might be called vin de terroir, original wines that truly matter, from vin d'effort, or wines of effort, that voodoo that we do in the New World so well. I won't belabor the point, but wines of terroir, wines that express a sense of place, deeply satisfy both our more refined aesthetic sensibilities and offer something like a visceral, emotional connection to the earth, to nature's order, and by extension to ourselves. You just feel differently when you taste a wine that comes from a place rather than one that comes from the laboratory of Dr. Faustus. In the old world, at least in many sectors, with some conspicuous exceptions that will remain nameless, like Bordeaux, terroir is taken more seriously than ever, especially by younger vintners. This is very good news indeed. These winemakers are looking backward to older techniques and varieties, to gentler practices, more respectful to their terroirs, excavating their patrimony for depth and meaning. The notion of terroir is no longer mere marketing legerdemain fueled by Gallic cynicism, but seems, at least to me, to be mostly the real deal. Allow me a parenthetical meta-message here, which may come off as a little new agey. First, you should know that I'm not, in fact, a new agey kind of guy, more of an old agey kind of guy, truth be told. But my sense is that we're living in a strange and magical time where a style of wine or grape variety that has languished for years can suddenly become popular due to mention in a hip-hop selection or being featured in a popular film. Obvious causal relationships like the one between high quality, fair price, and respectable sales volume no longer seem to obtain. Nevertheless, there seems to be something like an alchemical transformation taking place, a winnowing, if you will, in virtue of strong but highly erratic evolutionary pressures. We're living in our own sort of Venice ice age with the craziest sort of extreme weather. Very disparate sorts of species appear to be prospering, both the very pure and the very impure exemplars, you might say. maybe we tend to embrace the former as we recoil from the latter. It's enough to turn one to the extreme Manichaean worldview. I can't explain why cynical, spoofulated wines are ascendant, nor can I explain the presence of evil or evil in the world. I don't wish to prognosticate on the future of the fake and banal. I can only offer my thoughts on how we in the New World, absent pedigree, provenance, warrant, or credential, might proceed to find our way to sit at the same table with the grown-ups, that is, with wines expressive of a sense of place. Let's meditate a bit on how one might begin to approach what would appear to be an impossibly quixotic project, one that would seem to take literally multiple lifetimes, and we all know how mindful we Americans have been about taking pains to ensure a sustainable future. So I will only talk about wines that we might call real in the sense of possessing unique characteristics that differentiate them from everything else. This class of wine will not resemble the current crop of great monster wines of the New World, few possessing real distinctiveness, and many of which are already essentially caricatures of themselves, impressive in their own way, but at the same time, grotesqueries. That's Barry Bonds, by the way, who is alleged to use steroids. In broad terms, I envision that in the future, the model for great wines in the New World will embody a major paradigm shift from wines of effort to wines of terroir. To that end, the methodology of their production will have to significantly change. What we have done so well in the New World is to control things, from the clonal selections of our vineyards, to the way the vines are irrigated, to the designer yeasts and enzymes, to the cosmetic enhancements that impart improved texture, color, etc. But while wines are impressive, at least to some, they do tend to all look and taste alike. Perhaps this is a little unfair to say, but many of the great New World wines possess as much natural beauty as, say, a Las Vegas showgirl. Real wines of the future will derive their beauty and complexity from the genius, if it exists, of the site where the grapes are grown. And to achieve this, I believe there has to be a fundamental shift in approach, which, as luck would have it, aligns with the new reality of limited resources, as these resources begin to approach their real costs. Maybe it will not be the right solution for all vineyards, but for me, I envision the return of dry-farmed, head-trained vines, no wire, trellis, or drip system, an elegant, low-tech solution. You won't get the preternatural yields of an irrigated vineyard, but the wines will likely have more depth and personality. Which brings me seamlessly to another topic that I believe will have enormous relevance in the future, indeed, if there is to be anything like a future for us. This subject is the material called biochar. The most extraordinary research on its applications to vineyards is being done by a fellow called Hans-Peter Schmidt, who you see right there, who's studying the effects in the vineyards of the Valais in Switzerland, as well as in southern France. Biochar is essentially activated charcoal, which, when mixed with high-quality compost, takes on some very interesting agronomic properties. First, at high rates of application, about 20 tons per hectare, it can greatly enhance the water-holding capacity of soils by as much as 30 to 35%. In dry areas, this can really make a difference between being able to farm without supplemental irrigation or not. It also greatly enhances the fertility of the soil, building more organic matter, further enhancing the water-holding capacity. The other aspect of biochar, which is extremely interesting, is it stimulates the beneficial soil microflora, the mycorrhizae, or these are the symbiotic fungi that live in the root hairs of the plants, and they bring minerals into the plants. I should also mention lastly that biochar has the other property of sequestering atmospheric carbon dioxide for 5 to 10,000 years. It's kind of like reverse coal mining, if you will. While the subject of minerality is certainly fraught, there is no question in my mind that wines made from grapes grown in mineral-rich soils, as well as those possessing a healthy soil ecology, whether farmed organically or biodynamically, will exhibit what might be called a greater life force, or qi, which is another way of saying the ability to tolerate oxidative challenge. Put another way, I would suggest that it's impossible to think about greatness in wines absent the ability of these wines to age and gain in complexity. So the presence of biochar and higher levels of organic matter in soils support mycorrhizae and the uptake of minerals in the soil. We can perhaps think of them as terroir amplifiers. Another way of thinking about terroir, specifically the criteria for a great terroir, is to understand that this is a site that has managed to educe a greater degree of finesse and articulation from its grapes in comparison to its neighbors. And so much of this finesse is a function of buffering against extreme conditions, either drought or excessive moisture. Biochar has the capacity in some sense to make soils smarter, i.e., not only to enhance nutritional availability and disease resistance, but also to create a greater sense of homeostasis for the plant, i.e., more moderate growth and a buffering against stress. And this is especially valuable in light of global climate change and the dry conditions we already experience in California. Now here is a very interesting point that we might all meditate on for a moment. As I was learning more about biochar, I asked Peter Schmidt, so Peter, when you use biochar, aren't you in some sense deforming the terroir? Of course you are, he said, but actually no more than if you were to say, plow the field, which is itself a deformation. Well, in some sense, terroir may be thought of as a collection of inhering qualities of a site, transcending the stylistic imprint of the winemaker. At the same time, it is inextricably linked to the human beings who are there to discover and express it. So we can't help but meddle and muddle a bit. If we are clever and elegant, our meddling and muddling seem to fade seamlessly to the edges in the vin de terroir we might produce. But again, in the New World, absent hundreds of years of iteration and observation, how might one shine the light on the uniqueness of a given site to allow its voice to be heard and not get drowned out by other voices? I think that it's ultimately a question of signal-to-noise ratio, i.e., how much information is transmitted against the background of irrelevancy. What are the practices that amplify the signal of terroir but do not create excessive noise? Now, excessive noise could be the use of new oak, drip irrigation, or overripe grapes. I have a theory which may be right or wrong, and that is, if you can identify a place to grow grapes where there's a strong and articulate terroir, i.e. appropriate water-holding capacity and fertility characteristics, and an expressive mineral profile, perhaps it's not necessary that you be supremely clever or preternaturally lucky to be able to identify the perfect or most ideally matched grape variety to the site. Maybe it's really a question of just getting the gross phenology right, i.e. the ripening time, the Brix and acid balance. To go even further, perhaps the presence of strong varietal characteristics may actually work against the expression of soil characteristics. And I would cite here the wines of Jean-Michel Dice, whose mixed field blends of varieties that more or less ripen at the same time with the appropriate balance support the idea that a great terroir trumps the precision of the articulation of a single grape variety. Further, witness the wines of Los Bermejos in the Canary Islands, grown on pure basalt rock, made from the somewhat ignominious Listan Negro variety. The wines are brilliant and complex, and it's certainly not because of the inherent genius of their constituent grapes. Further, it's a basic tenet that multi-cepage wines are just the way to go in warmer Mediterranean climates. A single varietal wine cannot create the complexity and balance of a well-conceived blend in warmer, drier sites. And I will argue in a moment that we human beings cannot conceive of blends quite as complex as Mother Nature can potentially create for us. So if you take the idea to its logical conclusion of reordering the gestalt of the experience of a wine such that its varietal aspect is in the background and its soil characteristics are in the foreground, you will want to maximize the practices that reinforce the soil expression. My very radical, in the original sense of the word, idea is that perhaps by growing grapes from seed, you might end up with a much greater expression of soil characteristics than if you were to grow the grapes from conventionally grown rootings or grafts. This has not been studied in grapevines, as no one apart from breeders grows from seeds. But in fact, seedlings of virtually every woody plant exhibit different rooting behavior compared to plants grown from cuttings, i.e., they exhibit greater geotropism, or the tendency to grow in the direction of China. But I think that the greatest advantage of growing grapes from seeds is in the creation of minute and gross diversity in the resulting seedlings, thus leveraging the raw combinative power of nature to iterate enormously over a relatively short period of time. As an aside, you don't really want to collect seeds from self-pollinating vines, as these seedlings will express deleterious recessive alleles, resulting in inferior progeny. One will likely do much better to cross varieties with one another, which will lead to healthier plants, and when viewed as a population, potentially allow the emergence of certain individual plants with unique characteristics, or simply ones that clearly are a lot happier growing where they are than their confrère. So you try to be as thoughtful as you possibly can be about the qualities you're looking for in your grapes and the suitability of certain varieties for your site. How you do this is maybe a little tricky. I think you need to start with something like a baseline value, beginning with standard varieties on your site. See how they perform, and imagine how they might perhaps be nudged one way or another to become slightly more felicitously matched to your unique conditions. It's the female part of the cross that transmits the varietal characteristics to the progeny. So you might want to make sure that this is a variety that expresses well on your site. The male part of the cross is the one that carries the growth characteristics, the form of the vine, to the progeny. In my own case, growing grapes in a slightly warm, dry climate, I'm looking for an extremely vigorous male parent, one that has good drought tolerance. The bet, in a nutshell, is really this. If you begin with a grape that performs well on your site by creating minute variations between the various genotypes you've planted, might you have the wit to discern a particular individual or group of individuals that seem to be better suited to the site than the others, ripening a little earlier or later, or being more drought tolerant or disease resistant, through whatever criteria seem to be important in growing grapes on your site. The other part of the bet is that even if you do not live long enough or have the wit to discern real genius ensconced in your midst, will the sheer number of variations on a theme, as it were, after you've culled out the too early or too late ripening or sickly individuals that are clearly not with the program, will this create something like complex polyphony or something more like cacophony? Put another way, in a vineyard, is there something like the collective wisdom of a crowd? Now, my friend Robert pointed out to me earlier this morning that conventional crosses generally seem to be less interesting than the standard varieties, and I really couldn't disagree with him in that assessment. But the difference is, while modern crosses are generally less interesting than their brilliant parents, and I think specifically of Pinotage, and God forbid, after all this effort, I end up with Pinotage, I would argue that the individual vines, being less, even though they're less interesting than their parents, as a suite or as a population, there should be a great deal of complexity and nuance. So, in the end, I don't know if growing my grapes, the idea of my idea for growing grapes from seeds is the world's best idea or the world's worst idea. But if it were to work, i.e. the soil characteristics coming through in the wine itself, it would seem, at the very least, this is probably the closest thing you can get to a bespoke vineyard, and it would not taste anything like anyone else's wine. It seems, especially in light of global climate change and the incidence of new disease pressures on vines, that creating a rich, diverse planting stock for one's own unique vineyard would be both a reasonable strategy for true sustainability as well as a wonderful gift to give to the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Randall. So far, we've had Andrew telling us about telling stories, Randall giving us the materials to talk about. I need, as I said before, a dictionary for half of his talk to look up some of these words. But finally, we're going to end with Christian Payne, documentally, who is a professional storyteller. We want to show you the three aspects that make up the conference: the wine, the journalism, and also a little bit of the tech. So, Christian, take it away.
Thank you very much. I didn't put that there. Somebody else put that there. I was going to try and be smart and ask for a glass of wine when I got up here, but it was already on the table, and I'm thinking, can I come back next year, please? Where else? Where else? Okay, so I call myself a story maker for a good reason, I think. And I've titled this Authoritative Sources Amongst the Hyper-Connected. That was so that I could include the word source at some point. Everybody is blogging. I imagine everybody in this room is blogging, otherwise you probably wouldn't be at a conference for bloggers. Think of the other conferences going on in the world where the room is filled with bloggers as we're all communicating and sharing. And a lot of what's just been said, apart from some of the more hardcore wine stuff, I will own up to not being a wine mind. I'm going to try and enhance my dialogue from this is nice, and I'm sure that's going to happen by the end of tonight. For me, with 2 million blog posts written every day, I'm finding it kind of more and more interesting how certain people are kind of standing out, are networking, are connecting, are kind of plugging into the different types of different mediums. They're finding them how to get onto different screens, and they're just finding out how to be heard, I guess, in a lot of the cacophony. And as much of you guys aren't so much in competition as you are the social network yourselves, with everybody assisting, connecting with, and amplifying one another. There are so many things going on now that just fascinate me in the way of communication and how we plug into this. My grandmother, who has been on Twitter for a while, is 88 next week. She's now retiring from Twitter. Bit to health, but she's also kind of not finding a lot of the value she found initially. And the value that she found initially is nowhere near as much of the value that I got when, I've known this woman my entire life, and yet It was a tweet that kind of opened up a whole story about her I never knew about. So for me, these micro-blogging platforms, these very disposable comments in many ways, are keys and gateways, the small talk leading to big talk. And ultimately, one Twitter exchange ended up in a radio conversation on Canadian radio, interviewing my grandmother about how she was like smuggling messages past the Germans in the war in her bicycle seat. I thought she was a waitress. She told me she was a waitress because she didn't like the word spy or anything like that. And all of this kind of came out with her having conversations in front of me as I sat there and typed what she wanted to say whenever she said, "Can we speak to the people in the internet today?" And she kind of now sees that the internet isn't this other place. She sees how I use it, and it does freak her out a bit, but she's very happy when I go around and I've got a tablet device and we can talk to my brother in Brazil. And she sees that this is kind of an always-on kind of thing. And it was her that showed me that I use a phone to connect spaces, and these conversations link across these spaces. No different to when I speak to my grandmother on the phone. Not the most connected person in the world until I turn up and steal the neighbour's Wi-Fi so that we can go on the internet. But she realises that this is just a device enabling communication. We don't need to be scared of this. It's getting easier and easier the more we use it. On top of this, being a press photographer for the dailies for a good 2 years before I realised that I didn't want to work through so many people, everybody suddenly became a photographer. And those photographers in the room will realise that it's impossible for me to focus that camera and drink at the same time. This is the reason why I mostly don't use expensive cameras and use my phone now. I've evolved from the press photographer. If you were in my workshop earlier on, I may repeat a couple of stories about how this evolution was necessary for me to survive, for me to start using the spaces that were out there, for me to stop bowing down to the sub-editors and the editors that would decide your picture caption's too long, or your picture is the wrong shape to fit in with this advertisement. And it was wonderful to kind of take that control back and basically say, sod this, I'm kind of go it alone. I see a lot of people evolving, and they're kind of evolving in a certain direction where I think you need to think about this more. There are so many amazing things being said and being shared to spaces that don't care about the content you're saying and sharing. Unless you host your own blog, and that blog is potentially a WordPress blog, how do you know if that is going to exist in the next couple of years? Have you backed up every single story you've ever shared? I'm sure you haven't backed up your tweets. I'm very thankful for the conference to be backing up all the tweets that are shared with the hashtag. Don't forget, EWBC, please have your devices on but silent. For me, this is really important, and we watch this evolution. But don't get hung up on the terminology, don't get hung up on oh, it's all so techno-fangled, I don't think I can keep up. I remember 1982 when I was social networking on the CB radio, speaking to people I didn't meet in real life, staying up really late at night, having inane conversations that actually went on to some lifelong friendships and relationships. That's social networking. It's just social networking. Networking is inherently social. We like to put social on the front of everything. Media is inherently social. I was podcasting with cassette tapes, sharing them at school. I was the DJ, talking between songs. Here's a cassette tape, and then he would copy over it and give it me back. We couldn't afford many cassette tapes. I wish we could. I'd love to listen to them now. So this terminology scares a lot of people. A little bit like my avatar, actually, which I'm stuck with now, I'm afraid. My avatar was made for me in 2005 because I was a member of a group called the New Media Revolutionaries. We were going to use the internet to change people's minds. So I've stuck with my avatar because I think it's important you stick with your avatar, because it is your kind of recognizable. You stick with your avatar, you stick with your avatar. I'm a visual person. I'm rubbish with names. If someone comes up, we're spending 5 minutes talking before, I'm sorry, can I look at your avatar? It's you! Brilliant. For me, I really need that reference, especially when most of the time now, those that aren't complaining about the noise on the internet, we're filtering and we're scanning through really fast. We're not reading everything we see on the internet. Have you ever tried that? I tried it one night. There's a lot of things on the internet. And for me, seeing that avatar pop out of a familiar face that I normally connect with, it's kind of, what are they doing? How are they doing? I tend to connect with people smarter than me, which is a top tip if you do want to learn stuff and be involved. But for me, this assembling and creating with any digital device that comes to hand, this making of stories rather than just the telling of stories, because there are so many things we can do when there is content and data being created as well as curated and aggregated. This Internet of Things, with actually more things on the internet now being, talking to one another than human beings. That's why it's called the Internet of Things, funnily enough. How many people in the room, please put your hands up, are wearing jeans right now? That's a lot of people. How many people can tell me a story about their jeans? There's one person over there. Well, catch me afterwards in the bar. I'm fascinated at your jean story now. How many people with jeans have a pair that actually blog for themselves? Anybody? This Internet of Things is kind of strange. I bought these jeans, and when I bought these jeans, I opened them up, and inside it said, "A good artist always sign their work." And I'm like, that's interesting. Amanda made these jeans. Wow, that's amazing. I know the name of the person who made these jeans. And then on the other side, I'm not going to show you, it involves me taking my jeans off. It said, history tag, fill in this number on historytag.com. So I went to historytag.com and I put in the number. And my jeans had a blog. And the kind of weird thing was that the company who made my jeans had started blogging from the first stitch. They'd started creating the story all the way up to when my jeans were finished. And then my jeans arrived at me, and I had the responsibility to carry the story on for this object. So for me, this whole connection of the story, I suddenly had a responsibility. And now whenever I use a particular hashtag, and I can choose the hashtag, doesn't have to be an advertisement for the company, I can now carry on the kind of the story. Every Instagram, every tweet, every time I do something exciting in my jeans, I can log this online. Who cares? I kind of care, because I care about these more because that company cares about these jeans so much. They believe that I'm going to pass these on to somebody. I'm going to hand my jeans down, and when I do, you get a very comfortable pair of jeans. But you get their history and their story, and this object becomes more than just an item of clothing. Emotional narrative. And this emotional narrative is at the source of, I've said the word by accident, our lives, everything we do, and how passionate we are when we do all of this. You wouldn't be doing this if you weren't passionate. For me, it's not a daily grind. I absolutely love this, and I love this creating of stories. Wouldn't it be great, though, if I didn't actually have to comment all the time, and my jeans would actually tell me how far they're walking and how many steps they're climbing? Oh, actually, they do, don't they? Because I have an embedded computer in my jeans now. It's a very small Fitbit, if anybody has one of these. There's people who are into exercise that use these. These never leave these jeans. And it shares online how many steps, how many stairs I climb, how many steps I take in a day, how many calories I've burned whilst wearing these items. And I've selected a number of people who this information shares with. And they can see, by looking at their computer, and they get notifications on an app, how lazy I'm being. If I'm working all day staring at a screen, I'll get a nudge from somebody saying, "Ooh, that looks like a pretty heavy day. Have you taken a break?" And I'm like, I haven't, thank you so much. This kind of subconscious connection where my jeans are talking to somebody else's app and saying, he sat down for over an hour now and not moved, or longer. And it makes me do my 10,000 steps a day. I've now got an excuse to secretly go for a walk to the pub at night, just getting my steps up. And this kind of aggregation of data is making more stories than we know what to do with at the moment. And let's remember what a story is. Data plus time equals a story in many ways. This is my old Fitbit that got ran over when it fell off my pocket while I was riding a motorbike. They sent me a new one, which is very nice. This evolution for me didn't come to fruition until a turning point, a moment when I suddenly realized that I was kind of doing it wrong. I was using Twitter. I think my first account was 2006, this account 2007. But I was like, I'm a photographer, check me out. I've got a new lens. These are going to be the most amazing photos ever. And I was going on about how great I was and how great this was and there didn't seem to be that much true emotion and honesty there. And a kind of an opening up, a transparency as such, until this day when, I think it was February the 18th, 2008, when I was on the way to photograph the Gurkhas, and I was really excited about getting dirty and taking some images, and I lost control of my biodiesel Land Rover. It flipped over onto its roof, and I didn't know exactly what to do because I was in the middle of nowhere, and I had a phone, but I didn't want to scare anybody by saying, I've just rolled the car and I wasn't wearing my seatbelt. The biggest injury is from a camera in the back of my head. Instead of tweeting or sending a photograph, I knew the client that I was going to be late for, first time I'd ever been late for a job, was following me on Twitter. So I shot a short piece of video, and that piece of video went viral because it was happening right now. The decision for me to share the news as it was happening was huge, and I suddenly realized how important real time was. The fact I'd shared video meant that people could see me, hear me, feel what was going on, see the environment. There was an awful lot of information there, and I suddenly thought, wow, maybe I am kind of missing a trick here. Multimedia is important. My phone wouldn't stop ringing because I'm very accessible. My phone number's on the website. People phoning up, hi, your geotag position. I always geotag my position. It's about 2 miles away from my client who's got a crane. Do you want it? A crane? Crane would be really handy right now. Thank you, please. So a crane arrived. Hello, this is probably going to be a bit sneaky. I don't do many voices, sorry. But your Land Rover is on Flickr as well, isn't it? It is on Flickr. Your number plate, oh, did I not black it out? No, but my wife, she works at your bank. Okay. You know you've got free Automobile Association membership with your silver bank account. I didn't know that. Is that what I'm paying £6 a month for? They're on the way. Thank you very much, friendly stalker person. Twitter was going to be called Friend Stalker, remember that. Everybody wanted to help. There was a couple of people that did parody videos with Lego, which was funny after the event. We must do one about Roberts yesterday. But for me, it was such an eye-opener. The first time in my life I've put my hand up and said, don't take this out of context if you're shooting video. I'm an arse. I've really cocked up. I don't know what I'm going to do. Can somebody help? And everybody did. And they came again and again and again. One woman in America called OTIR set up a web page with Chip In, one of the first crowdsourced funding websites. Help Documentally back to work. People were donating money, a lot of money. I won't tell you how I got my motorbike, but it took me ages to tell them to stop. They went to my donate to this blog page. Needless to say, I started thinking about this storytelling on the move. I started thinking about the shape of stories. Why are big stories better than little stories? Are disposable comments online? Can they be curated into something bigger? Why are our stories a particular shape? Why are journalists called hacks? Is it because they have to chop a story down so it fits next to an advert? It's not, actually. It comes from the term hackney. Type of horse that's easy to... that's what Wikipedia says anyway. Check your sources, obviously. For me, I'm still kind of in many ways stuck into the linear form of a blog post, although I do try to curate in from multiple places and multiple platforms. This is how I'll use my blog. I'll start off with a photo to draw you in, then I'll have some heavily linked text. It's very important to backlink not only to your own stuff, but other stuff, resources, spaces. Then another photograph to kind of set the scene. Remember, if you're doing documentary photos, somewhere within the story you want a close-up, a wide, and a mid shot. I also would like some kind of audio. Audio, to me, is one of the most important types of media for sharing stories. Who uses audio? Who's a podcaster? You use audio. That is insane. That is incredible when you think about the power of audio and how everybody's too busy to read your text now. Deliver your blog. Even if you just read it out onto a one-touch podcasting app, they can be driving the car, they can be drinking wine somewhere, listening to your glorious words being delivered straight into their head, this theatre of the mind. I think that's so important. And then I like to put the video right at the bottom. Not that I'm trivializing video to those holding the video cameras, best shots please, but because people seem to live in this TV mindset where everything is delivered to them through the television and this is all the story I need. So I'll just kind of supplement and complement the story with that. So I talked about creation, aggregation, and then curation. And we need to remember, aggregation is not curation, but curation can use aggregation tools. And if anybody uses Paperly in the room, stop it. And I love seeing people go, yes, there's one clap for stopping Paperly. But I see people on Twitter saying, oh, thanks for including me in your newspaper. They didn't do anything. It's automatic. It just looks at how many things are retweeted and then tries to deliver you what it thinks is important. which is mostly celebrity gossip. So there are aggregation tools that work better than that. For me, you can't beat human web when it comes to human web versus machine web. It's human web all the way where possible. This is why I'm looking forward to where there's less flakier platforms like Storify, so that we can, for example, bring together, let me just go back one, I've done it again with my itchy finger, where we can bring together all kinds of content from all kinds of platforms. What this doesn't do is enable me to export this somewhere a little bit more solid, because what happens when Facebook decide to show their true evilness, allegedly, and Instagram does some really weird stuff with our photography, which they are quite right to do because we sign over all rights when we use it. What happens when Twitter gets bought out by Facebook or whatever's likely to happen? What happens to all these stories? Do our blog posts suddenly have big gaping holes in as we suffer link rot, as so many other places are? I can tell you of a number of platforms I use that don't exist anymore, where in one case 6,000 videos disappeared from the internet that I had done alone. That's an awful lot. Luckily I had a kind of a secret backup that I managed to get from the company beforehand, but not many people were that lucky. So I love the concept of us being able to pull everything in, and I believe this conference is making a really interesting effort of pulling all of this so it can be archived and maybe even released as an ebook. I totally see the place for these 3 different types in my mind. You know, my tweets are disposable and throwaway. I don't expect to be able to search them in the next couple of weeks because the internet's moving too fast. I do archive them and back them up to calendars and things. I have Tumblr and small blogs like that, which enable me to send out a photo and a little bit of text. It's like a flyer, a visiting card. I also will throw video and audio onto that kind of space. And then I have my kind of main WordPress blog post. That's my magazine article. I like to take a little bit more time over that. And then I will get round to writing a book, because sometimes I don't feel like I'm justified standing here unless I've got something to hold up. It might just be a notebook with my name on the front that you can all fill in. I don't seem to have much time other than that. I was in the attic the other day and I found no end of these huge, weird things you grow plants inside that nobody actually uses because they die really quickly. Big, like, goldfish bowl and 2 aluminium flight cases. And I found every single wine cork from every bottle that I cared about or conversation I cared about I was having when I drank that bottle since 1991. I could build a shed with those corks. I might build a shed with those corks. But what was really interesting is when I looked at those corks, and the 17th to the 11th, 2004, I typed it in, and it coincided with the day loads of friends came around and we wrote music on African drums, and I could listen to a track that we made, and I thought, wow, I never realized I had this kind of physical diary object thing. Wouldn't it be great if we had, you know, every wine bottle you bought, potentially, the cork actually shared stories with youth that other people had internationally around the world, but had contextually been selected just for you as an English speaker or just for you as whatever. There are so many ways for us to attach and connect these stories to everyday objects that are relevant to us. I want you to think about where your stories, where your thoughts, where your feelings are going to end up, because it's not just going to be on a screen anymore. It's going to be embedded. You can do this right now. You can walk down a road, and if you see a poster, you can tie a URL to that poster with an app. So if anybody else walking along in January or February when Google Glasses come out, they look at that poster and your story is delivered to them. I'm fascinated by this. This data plus time equals a story. For me, digital storytelling, the attaching of narrative to digital content, includes audio, geographic data, photos, text, and video. And you might be a little bit nervous doing some of these. Experiment, have a play. You don't have to make it all public, but you might suddenly realize that we are all visual people, we are auditory people, we're olfactory, of course, and again, text does a wonderful job of bonding all of this together. But you will reach me much easier when I can download your audio and carry it with me, as I imagine there's huge swathes of the population out there. That's how I tell story. I go on and on about audio because I think it's underused, yet radio hasn't gone away. It's still as popular as it always was. Why? Well, maybe because it's lightweight. When we don't have the internet connection, we can share audio faster and quicker than anything else, and download as well. You hear this theatre of the mind all the time. It's like giving someone a podcast is like giving them a book. they fill in the spaces with their own memories, thoughts, and feelings, and they really take to heart and personalize what you are saying. You're inside their head, for one thing, particularly if they're wearing headphones. It's less obtrusive, capturing audio in particular and listening to it. Who knows what kind of adventure you're on when you're sat there with headphones in a queue or in a traffic jam. For me as well, when I'm interviewing and capturing stories, just having that microphone between me. I am doing an interview workshop later on, which has exactly the same slide, so don't listen too hard if you're coming to that. It's a multitasking media. People can do other things whilst they're listening to what you're saying. So for me, so many reasons why. It's the intimacy is the key thing. I have a series of tools that I use for different reasons. You should find your own toolkit, and this toolkit is what's going to carry you through. For audio, I use AudioBoo more than anything else. You don't worry about holding your massive iPads up to photograph this, because I think the slides will be available. Of course, I'm stuck with a phone. I unfortunately went down the Apple path. They've promised me this. I can't wait. My closing thoughts: think about the medium and the platform. Be passionate, converse, inform and interact. Don't write stories. This was stolen off a notice board at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Institute. They're using stories as a weapon. Do not underestimate the power. They're talking about brainwashing on the whole. Good content always finds an audience. That was me only last week in Styrian wine region. Look, I do go to nice places. Great stories happen to those who tell them. And whatever it is you want to be, because you're all here to be heard and find new ways of communicating as much as connecting with those around you. Just make sure that you're inspired. People will see that above everything else. Go back to the source of what it is you believe in, and then share that feeling of inspiration. That's assigned to a wine conference, not the toilet, although I'm sure a few people possibly do need the toilet right now. Thank you very much.